everyone avoids you. When you walk down the street, people cross to the other side. When you enter a tavern, conversations stop, and patrons suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. When you reach out to touch something in the market, the merchant flinches. Your money is good. Everyone's money is good, but the merchant will wash the coins before putting them in his purse, as if your touch had contaminated them. You live outside the city walls, in a house that everyone knows and no one visits. Your children play alone. Your wife shops quickly, eyes down, speaking to no one. When your daughter comes of age, she will marry the son of another executioner, or the son of a gravedigger, or she will not marry at all. No respectable family will accept her. No guild will take your son as apprentice. The taint follows your bloodline like a curse, and yet you are essential. Without you, the law cannot function. Without you, murderers would go unpunished. Thieves would escape justice. The social order would collapse. You are the instrument of the state, the hand that swings the sword, the arm that pulls the lever. You are the executioner, the hangman, the headsman. You are the most necessary and the most despised man in town, not welcome to the brutal reality of being a medieval executioner. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, the algorithm treats me about as well as medieval society treated its executioners. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You're standing outside the city walls, looking at the house where you'll spend your life. The executioner occupied a unique position in medieval and early modern society. He was legally infamous, a technical term meaning he had no honor, could not testify in court, could not join a guild, could not hold public office. He was polluted by his contact with death, with criminals, with the dirty work of punishment. And yet he was a government official, appointed by the city council or the territorial lord, paid a salary, sometimes quite well compensated. This contradiction essential but untouchable, necessary but despised defined the executioner's existence. Society needed someone to do the killing, but it couldn't forgive that person for doing it. The executioner bore the sin of judicial violence so that everyone else could keep their hands clean and their consciences clear. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what it meant to live this life. How you became an executioner, what you actually did, how you were treated, how you survived psychologically. We have an extraordinary window into this world. The Diary of Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg from 1573 to 1617, who recorded 394 executions and countless acts of torture in meticulous detail. This is the brutal reality of being a medieval executioner. Get comfortable. The scaffold awaits. You didn't choose to become an executioner. Nobody chose. The profession was hereditary, passed from father to son like a genetic disease that could never be cured. You were born into it, and you would die in it, and so would your children after you. The logic was grimly practical. Since executioners were socially polluted, untouchable, infamous, no one from an honorable family would ever take up the trade. Why would they? To become an executioner was to condemn yourself and all your descendants to permanent exclusion from respectable society. Only someone who was already excluded the son of an existing executioner had nothing to lose, and so the trade became a caste. Executioner families married other executioner families. They formed networks across regions, recommending cousins for positions, training nephews in the craft. In some German territories, the same families held executioner positions for generations, creating dynasties of death dot. If your father was an executioner, your fate was sealed from birth. You would grow up in the executioner's house, watching your father leave for work and return with blood on his clothes. You would hear the whispers of other children, feel their parents pull them away when you approached. You would understand gradually that you were different, marked, set apart. Some boys resisted. They ran away, tried to apprentice themselves to craftsmen in distant cities where no one knew their origins. But the system usually caught up with them. Someone would recognize them, or their paperwork would reveal their parentage, and they would be expelled from the guild. Their brief escape from destiny ended. Others accepted their fate with resignation or even pride. If you had to be an executioner, you could at least be a good one. You could master the craft, build a reputation for clean kills, earn the respect that came from professional competence, if not social acceptance. Franz Schmidt, whose diary gives us our best window into this world, was the son of an executioner. His father Heinrich had been forced into the trade. The story goes that he was compelled to execute a criminal when no official executioner was available, and this single act condemned him and his descendants to the profession forever. Whether or not the story is true, Franz believed it, and he spent his entire career trying to escape the taint his father had passed down. The executioner's house stood outside the city walls. This wasn't coincidence, it was law. The executioner was too polluted, too contaminated by death to live among respectable citizens. He was banished to the margins, physically as well as socially. The location varied by city. Sometimes the executioner's house was near the city gate, convenient for accessing the execution grounds, but clearly separate from the town proper. Sometimes it was further out, near the gallows themselves, a permanent reminder of the connection between the man and his work. Sometimes it was in a disreputable district, among the other dishonorable trades: tanners, gravediggers, skinners of dead animals. The house itself might be quite substantial. Executioners were often well paid. The job was dangerous, unpleasant, and required genuine skill, so cities had to offer competitive compensation. A successful executioner might have a comfortable home, good furniture, even servants. But no amount of material comfort could compensate for the isolation. Visitors were rare. No respectable citizen would be seen entering the executioner's house. A social contamination might spread to them. Business had to be conducted at the margins. A quick word at the market, a message sent through intermediaries, payment delivered by a servant. Even the city officials who employed the executioner often kept their distance, issuing orders through paperwork rather than personal contact. The executioner's family lived in this isolation together. His wife, if she came from an honorable family, had sacrificed her status to marry him. More likely, she was the daughter of another dishonorable tradesman. His children grew up knowing only the company of their own family and this occasional visit from relatives in the same profession. The house was marked. Everyone knew which house belonged to the executioner, and everyone avoided it. Children dared each other to touch the door. Adults crossed the street rather than walk too close. The house was a landmark of contamination. a permanent reminder of the violence that made civilization possible. If you're enjoying this exploration of medieval social outcasts, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the depths of dishonor are only beginning. The executioner's exclusion from society wasn't just social custom, it was legal reality. The concept of infamy or dishonor had specific legal consequences that touched every aspect of life. An infamous person could not testify in court. Your word had no legal weight. If you witnessed a crime, your testimony was worthless. If someone wronged you, your accusation meant nothing. You existed outside the legal system, except as its instrument. An infamous person could not join a guild. The guild system was the economic backbone of medieval and early modern cities. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds that controlled training, quality, prices, and access to the trade. Without guild membership, you couldn't practice most skilled professions. The executioner's children were locked out of virtually every respectable career. An infamous person could not hold public office. No matter how wealthy or intelligent you might be, you could never become a city councilman, a judge, a mayor. Political participation was closed to you. An infamous person could not be buried in consecrated ground. When you died, your body would be excluded from the churchyard, buried instead in unhallowed ground outside the cemetery walls. Even in death, you remained an outcast. The infamy was heritable. It passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, contaminating the entire bloodline. Your children had done nothing wrong. They had simply been born to the wrong parents. But they inherited your dishonor as surely as they inherited your eye color. This legal framework created a permanent underclass. Executioners, gravediggers, tanners, skinners, prostitutes, actors, musicians, all the dishonorable trades were lumped together, forced to intermarry, unable to escape their status. The system was designed to be inescapable, a caste as rigid as anything in India. Becoming an executioner required training. This wasn't work you could improvise. It required knowledge of anatomy, of technique, of the dozens of different ways the law demanded that criminals be punished. A botched execution was more than embarrassing. It could get you killed by an angry mob. Training began in childhood. Watching your father work, you would attend executions from a young age, standing near the scaffold, observing technique. You would learn to read the crowd, to sense when they were satisfied and when they were turning ugly. You would see what happened when things went wrong. As you grew older, your father would begin explaining the craft. The sword had to be swung at exactly the right angle to sever the head cleanly. The rope had to be positioned precisely to ensure unconsciousness came quickly. The wheel had to break bones in the correct sequence to maximize suffering without causing immediate death. Every method had its requirements, its tricks, its potential failures. You would practice on animals first, or so the sources suggest. Pigs and sheep were stand-ins for human bodies, allowing apprentice executioners to learn their strokes before attempting them on living criminals. The transition to human subjects was gradual, assisting at executions before eventually taking the lead role. The apprenticeship lasted years. You might begin assisting your father at 14 or 15, but you wouldn't become a master executioner until your 20s or even 30s. The title master was meaningful. It indicated that you had demonstrated competence, that you could be trusted to perform executions without supervision. Some executioners sought additional training, traveling to other cities to learn from famous practitioners, picking up new techniques and methods. The profession had its experts, its innovations, its ongoing debates about best practices. How long should the torture last before a confession was reliable? What was the most merciful way to kill by fire? These were professional questions with professional answers. The knowledge was jealously guarded. Executioner families maintained their trade secrets, passing them down within the bloodline, sharing them only with other executioners. This monopoly on knowledge helped maintain their position. No one else knew how to do their job. The executioner's tools were extensions of his craft, each designed for specific purposes, each requiring maintenance and expertise. A professional executioner accumulated an arsenal over his career. The sword was the most prestigious tool, used for beheading nobles and serious criminals who merited an honorable death. The executioner's sword was typically a two-handed weapon with a broad, heavy blade designed for cutting rather than thrusting. The tip was often rounded or squared. There was no need for a point. The blade had to be kept razor sharp. A dull sword meant multiple strokes, suffering, and humiliation. Some executioners owned multiple swords. A master might have a fine sword for high-status executions, inscribed with pious mottos or decorated with religious imagery, and a plainer working sword for routine beheadings. The sword was often passed down from father to son, accumulating history with each use. The rope was the most common tool. Hanging was the standard execution for common criminals, requiring less skill than the sword, but still demanding competence. The rope had to be the right thickness, the right length, and not positioned correctly. A short drop meant slow strangulation. The long drop that broke the neck was a much later innovation. The wheel was a wooden cartwheel, sometimes specially made, sometimes repurposed from an actual cart. The executioner used heavy iron bars to break the criminal's limbs, one by one, threading the shattered body through the spokes. The wheel was for the worst criminals, murderers, highway robbers, those who had violated the social order most grievously. Other tools filled out the collection. Axes for cheaper beheadings, iron tongs for tearing flesh, branding irons for marking criminals, rods and whips for corporal punishment. The executioner also maintained the physical infrastructure of justice: the gallows, the scaffold, the pillory, the stocks. He was carpenter as well as killer. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to walk through an execution from beginning to end. The day began before dawn. The executioner rose early, checking his equipment, ensuring the blade was sharp, the rope sound, everything in order. A professional took no chances. One moment of unpreparedness could mean disaster. The condemned had spent the night in prison, usually visited by a priest or chaplain, who heard confession and offered last rites. By morning, the criminal had theoretically made peace with God, ready to face divine judgment. In practice, many spent the night in terror, weeping, praying, or simply staring at the walls. The procession formed mid-morning. The condemned was brought from the prison, sometimes walking, sometimes carried in a cart if the crime warranted additional humiliation. The executioner walked alongside or followed behind. Guards kept order. A crowd gathered, growing as the procession moved through the streets. The route to the scaffold was usually fixed by tradition, the same streets for every execution, past the same landmarks, giving the condemned maximum exposure to public view. This was part of the punishment. The shame of being paraded through town, the jeers and insults of the crowd, the knowledge that everyone was watching your final journey out at the scaffold. The executioner took over. He positioned the condemned, made final preparations, perhaps exchanged a few words. Some condemned asked forgiveness. It was traditional for the executioner to grant it. I forgive you as I hope God forgives me. A formula that acknowledged the strange transaction taking place, then the killing. Sword, rope, wheel, fire, whatever the sentence required, the executioner performed it. Quickly if he was merciful or skilled, slowly if the sentence demanded suffering. The crowd watched, cheered, or groaned, satisfied or horrified, depending on the performance. Afterwards, the executioner dealt with the body. Some were buried, some displayed on the wheel or gibbet as warnings, some handed over to families for private burial. The scaffold was cleaned, the tools put away. The executioner returned home, perhaps stopping at a tavern where no one would sit near him, to drink alone until the next time. Beheading by sword was considered the honorable death. It was reserved for nobles, for criminals of high status, for those whose crimes, while serious, didn't warrant the degradation of hanging or the agony of the wheel. To be beheaded was almost a privilege. The theory was that death by sword was quick, clean, and dignified. One stroke, and it was over. No struggling, no choking, no extended suffering. The condemned knelt, bared their neck, and received death like a gentleman. The body could be buried intact, the head reunited with it for a proper funeral. The reality was more complicated. Beheading required enormous skill. The neck is small, the vertebrae close together, the muscles resistant to cutting. The executioner had to strike at exactly the right spot, with exactly the right angle, with exactly enough force to sever the head in a single stroke. A single stroke was crucial. Multiple strokes meant suffering, meant incompetence, meant shame for both the executioner and the condemned. 3 strokes was a disaster. 4 or 5 was a scandal that might end the executioner's career or his life. If the crowd turned ugly, the executioner's reputation rested largely on his skill with the sword. Franz Schmidt recorded his successes with professional pride. Executed with the sword went well. He also recorded his failures, though more tersely. A master executioner might perform hundreds of beheadings over his career. The best became famous for their clean strokes. The condemned contributed to the outcome. They had to kneel correctly, hold still, keep their neck properly positioned. If they flinched, moved, resisted, the stroke might go wrong. Some condemned were given alcohol to calm their nerves. Others were so terrified they had to be held in place by assistants. The moment of the stroke was preceded by a ritual. The executioner would ask the condemned for forgiveness. The condemned would pray, perhaps speak final words, commend their soul to God. Then silence, tension, the flash of the blade, and either a clean death or a nightmare. Hanging was the common death for common criminals. Thieves, burglars, minor offenders, those who didn't merit the honor of the sword or the horror of the wheel were simply hanged. It was efficient, required less skill, and could process multiple criminals at once. The medieval and early modern gallows was a permanent structure, usually located outside the city walls, visible from the roads as a warning to travelers. Some gallows were simple, a beam between 2 posts. Others were elaborate, stone towers, multiple beams, capable of displaying a dozen bodies at once. The hanging itself was brutal by modern standards. The short drop method was standard. The condemned was placed on a ladder or cart with a rope around their neck. Then the support was removed. Death came not from a broken neck, but from strangulation, a process that could take several minutes of visible struggle. The executioner could show mercy or cruelty. Pulling on the condemned's legs hastened death by adding weight, compressing the airway more quickly. Some executioners did this routinely. Others let nature take its course. Family members sometimes bribed the executioner to ensure they're loved. One died quickly. The bodies were often left hanging as warnings. Days, weeks, sometimes months, the corpses rotted on the gallows, picked at by birds, until finally cut down and buried in unconsecrated ground. The gallows served as a permanent advertisement for the consequences of crime-got mass hangings were not uncommon. After a major crime wave, or following the suppression of a rebellion, dozens might be hanged in a single day. The executioner would work through them methodically, one after another, until the scaffold was full of swaying bodies. Hanging accidents happened. Ropes broke, leaving the condemned alive and injured. Knots slipped, requiring the whole process to start again. The condemned sometimes survived longer than expected, hanging and struggling while the crowd grew restless. These failures reflected badly on the executioner's competence. The wheel was reserved for the worst criminals: murderers, highway robbers, those who had killed with particular cruelty. It was a death designed to match the crime agonizing, prolonged, public. The wheel announced that some crimes deserved more than simple death. The procedure was methodical and horrible. The condemned was spread-eagled on the ground, tied to stakes or a wooden frame. The executioner used heavy iron bars, or sometimes the executioner's wheel itself, to systematically break the bones of the limbs. Starting with the legs, moving to the arms, each major bone was shattered with powerful blows. The sequence was prescribed by law or custom. Some jurisdictions specified starting with the shins, moving to the thighs, and the arms. Others varied the order. The blows had to be placed precisely breaking the bone without destroying the flesh, prolonging life and therefore suffering. After the bones were broken, the shattered body was woven through the spokes of a cartwheel and hoisted on a pole. The condemned remained there, suspended above the crowd, still alive if the executioner had done his job correctly. Death might come after hours, even days, from shock, blood loss, or exposure. The coup de grace is a mercy, not a requirement. A blow to the chest or throat that killed the condemned outright could be ordered by the judge or granted by the executioner. Breaking from above, starting with the chest rather than the legs, was merciful because death came quickly. Breaking from below was the full punishment. Franz Schmidt recorded wheel executions in his diary with the same methodical detail as his other work. He noted when the condemned died quickly and when they lingered. He recorded when he was ordered to show mercy and when mercy was forbidden. The wheel was part of his professional repertoire, as routine as the sword. The crowd watched these executions with particular attention. The wheel was spectacle, entertainment, a demonstration of justice's power. Vendors sold food and drink. Parents brought children. The prolonged dying was the point. It was meant to be witnessed, meant to terrify, meant to demonstrate that some crimes were beyond ordinary punishment. If you're still with me in this exploration of medieval death, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime listening. And speaking of dark topics, let's talk about burning. Fire was the punishment for crimes against God, heresy, witchcraft, sodomy, bestiality. These were sins as well as crimes, offenses that contaminated not just the social order, but the spiritual realm. Fire purified. Fire destroyed body and soul alike, ensuring the criminal could not be resurrected, could not be saved, was simply erased. The burning was conducted at a stake, a wooden post, driven into the ground, surrounded by kindling and larger logs. The condemned was tied to the stake, standing upright, facing the crowd. The executioner lit the fire and stepped back to watch. Death by fire was agonizing but variable. If the wood was dry and plentiful, if the wind was right, the flames rose quickly, and the condemned might die relatively fast from smoke inhalation or shock. If the wood was green or wet, if the wind blew the flames away from the body, death could take an hour or more. The condemned screaming as they roasted. The executioner could offer mercy in several ways. Strangulation before lighting the fire, a quick death, while the fire served only for spectacle. A bag of gunpowder hung around the neck. When the flames reached it, a quick explosion ended the suffering. These mercies were sometimes officially ordered, sometimes secretly provided, sometimes purchased by the condemned's family. Without mercy, burning alive was perhaps the most terrible death the law could inflict. The condemned was conscious as their flesh blackened and crisped, as their extremities burned away, as the fire slowly consumed them from the outside in. Some lasted remarkably long, still moving, still screaming, while spectators watched in horrified fascination. The witch trials of the early modern period made burning tragically common. Franz Schmidt burned numerous convicted witches during his career, recording each one in his diary with the same professional detachment he brought to other executions. For him, it was work. For the condemned, it was a nightmare beyond imagination. The executioner wasn't just responsible for killing. He was also the official torturer, the man who extracted confessions through pain, who broke bodies to get at truth, or what passed for truth in a confession-based legal system. Torture was legal, regulated, and considered a normal part of judicial procedure throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The theory was that truth could be extracted through pain, that criminals who denied their guilt would confess when subjected to sufficient suffering. The practice was that torture produced confessions true or false. Because people will say anything to make the pain stop, the executioner conducted the formal interrogation under torture. He was supervised by judges or magistrates, but he was the one who operated the instruments, who knew how far to push before death became imminent, who calibrated suffering for maximum effect. His expertise was in anatomy and pain. He knew which methods produced the most agony without causing immediate death. He knew how to damage a body without destroying it. The subject had to remain alive long enough to confess, and sometimes to be executed afterwards. He knew how to read signs of genuine distress versus theatrical resistance. The torture chamber was often in the same building as the prison, sometimes beneath the town hall. It was equipped with specialized instruments: the rack for stretching, the strappado for dislocating shoulders, thumb screws for crushing fingers, leg screws for crushing shins. The executioner maintained these instruments and knew how to use each one. Sessions were recorded by court clerks, who noted the questions asked, the responses given, the instruments applied. Confessions obtained under torture were theoretically supposed to be confirmed freely. Afterwards, But with the torturer standing ready to resume, few people recanted. The system was designed to produce convictions. The executioner tortured the same people he would later execute. He might break a man's body on the rack one day and break it on the wheel the next. The continuity was part of his professional identity. He was responsible for criminals from interrogation through punishment to death. The law distinguished between degrees of torture, supposedly limiting its severity, theoretically preventing excessive cruelty. In practice, these distinctions often provided cover for escalating brutality. The question ordinary was the first level of torture, applied when there was strong suspicion, but no confession. It typically involved showing the instruments to the accused, explaining what would happen, perhaps beginning with lighter methods. The threat was often enough many confessed at this stage. Before the real pain began. If ordinary questioning failed to produce a confession, the court could authorize the question extraordinary, intensified torture, harsher methods, greater suffering. This required formal approval, documentation, theoretical oversight. The escalation was supposed to be controlled, measured, appropriate to the severity of the suspected crime. The instruments had their hierarchy. Thumb screws were relatively mild, crushing the fingers painfully, but not usually permanently. The strappado hoisting the subject by arms, tied behind the back dislocated, shoulders and caused extreme pain, but left the subject alive and recoverable. The rack stretched the body, separating joints, tearing muscles, potentially crippling, but rarely fatal. Water torture was favored in some jurisdictions, forcing water into the subject's stomach until it swelled grotesquely, producing agony and the sensation of drowning. Fire torture applied heat to the feet, burning them slowly. Specialized tools existed for crushing, cutting, burning. Pulling. The ingenuity applied to causing pain was remarkable. The executioner was supposed to stop before death. A subject who died under torture had escaped execution, which frustrated the judicial process and raised questions about the torturer's competence. But accidents happened. Subjects whose hearts gave out, who choked on blood, who simply stopped living when the pain exceeded human endurance. The executioner's reputation included his skill as a torturer. A man who could extract confessions quickly, without killing the subject, without causing unnecessary permanent damage, was valued. Franz Schmidt recorded his torture sessions alongside his executions, noting which methods produced confessions and how long the process took. We know more about the life of a medieval executioner than we might expect, thanks to one extraordinary man, Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg from 1573 to 1617. Franz kept a diary, recording 394 executions and countless acts of corporal punishment and torture. This diary survived, giving us an unparalleled window into the executioner's world. Franz was born in 1554 in Hof, Bavaria, the son of Heinrich Schmidt, an executioner. According to family tradition, Heinrich had been forced into the trade against his will, compelled to execute a criminal when no official executioner was available, and this single act had condemned his entire line to the profession. Franz grew up with this story, seeing himself as unjustly tainted by his father's misfortune. He began assisting his father as a young man and took over as executioner of Nuremberg in 1578 at about age 24. Nuremberg was one of the largest and most important cities in the Holy Roman Empire, and the position of executioner there was prestigious, as much as any executioner's position could be. France kept his diary in a small notebook, recording each execution in terse, professional prose. Hans Vogel of Auerbach, a thief, hanged. Margaret Noren of Nuremberg, a witch, burned. Entry after entry, year after year. The diary accumulated a catalogue of criminal Nuremberg, but France recorded more than bare facts. He noted when executions went well and when they went poorly. He recorded the crimes of the condemned, sometimes in considerable detail. He expressed opinions about guilt and innocence, about justice and mercy. Reading his diary, we see not a monster, but a professional. A man doing a job he had not chosen, doing it as well as he could. France also recorded his life's goal, rehabilitation. He wanted to escape the taint of infamy, to restore honor to his family, to prove that an executioner could be a respectable man. He lived soberly, worked diligently, maintained his reputation. And in the end, remarkably, he succeeded, but that story comes later. Franz Schmidt's diary records the variety of criminal Nuremberg, murderers and thieves, forgers and con artists, rapists and robbers, heretics and witches. Reading his entries, we see the dark underside of early modern urban life. Theft was the most common crime leading to execution. Repeat offenders, especially those who had already been branded or mutilated as punishment for earlier thefts, faced the gallows. France hanged dozens of thieves over his career men and women who had stolen money, goods, livestock, anything of value. Poverty drove many to crime. Crime drove many to the scaffold. Murder brought the wheel. France recorded murderers who killed for money, for revenge, for reasons that made no sense. He recorded domestic violence, wives who poisoned husbands, husbands who beat wives to death. He recorded murders of strangers, of acquaintances, of family members. Each went to the wheel, bones broken systematically, while the crowd watched. Infanticide was terrifyingly common. Young women, often servants, who became pregnant outside marriage and faced social ruin, killed their newborns and tried to hide the bodies. France executed many such women, usually by drowning or burying alive punishments that echoed their crimes. His diary entries are brief, but hint at tragedy. Desperate women caught in impossible circumstances. Witchcraft. Accusations came in waves, particularly during periods of social stress. France burned accused witches, recording their confessions, the Sabbaths they claimed to attend, the demons they allegedly served. Whether he believed in their guilt is unclear. His entries maintain professional neutrality, recording the sentence and its execution without editorial comment. Highway robbers, counterfeiters, arsonists, sodomites. France dealt with them all. His diary is a census of early modern crime, a record of how society responded to those who violated its norms. It's also a record of early modern death, entry after entry marking lives ended by the state's hand by France's hand. How did an executioner live with his work? How did he wake up each morning, knowing that his job was to kill, to torture, to inflict suffering? What did it do to a man, spending his entire life dealing death? The sources are largely silent on executioners' inner lives. They left few personal reflections, no memoirs exploring their feelings. We have Franz Schmidt's diary, but it's professional, not confessional. He records what he did, not what he felt about it. We're left to infer the psychological reality from scattered clues. Routine seems to have been essential. Executions were work, and like any work, They became familiar with repetition. The 20th hanging was not as affecting as the first. The 100th beheading was simply another entry in the diary. Routine normalized killing made it manageable, prevented each death from carrying its full emotional weight. Religious framework provided justification. The executioner was an instrument of divine as well as human justice. The condemned deserved their fate. They had violated God's law as well as man's, and their punishment was righteous. The executioner was not a murderer, but an agent of order doing God's work. This theological interpretation allowed executioners to see themselves as serving good rather than committing evil. Professional identity offered another layer of protection. Being a skilled executioner, performing cleanly and efficiently, provided a source of pride independent of the act's moral content. Franz Schmidt clearly took pride in his craftsmanship, recording when executions went well. Focusing on technique displaced focus on killing. Still, the strain must have shown. Executioners were known for heavy drinking. Alcohol was a constant companion, a way of dulling the edges. Some executioners reportedly went mad, broken by years of blood. Others became cruel, seemingly enjoying their work, the power over life and death. The job took its toll, even on those who seemed to bear it well. And then there was the social isolation. An executioner had no one to talk to, no one who understood, no one who shared his experience. His colleagues were other executioners, met at annual gatherings or through professional correspondence. His isolation was not just social, but psychological. He carried his burden alone. Here's a paradox. The same man who killed and tortured also healed. The executioner was often the closest thing to a medical professional that common people could afford, and they came to him for remedies, treatments, and cures. The logic was strange but consistent. The executioner knew anatomy. He had to do his job properly. He knew where the bones were, how the muscles connected, what happened when bodies broke. This knowledge could be used to harm, but it could also be used to heal, setting broken bones, treating dislocations, tending wounds. The executioner's skills had medical applications. More importantly, the executioner had access to powerful medicines unavailable elsewhere. Human body parts. The bodies of the executed were believed to have medical and magical properties. Blood, fat, skin, bones, even rope used for hanging, all were considered potent remedies for various ailments. Human fat was used to treat wounds, arthritis, and rheumatism. Rubbed into aching joints or applied to injuries, it was believed to promote healing. Executioners rendered fat from the bodies they processed and sold it to apothecaries and directly to patients. It was a significant source of income. Blood, fresh from an execution, was believed to cure epilepsy. Sufferers would position themselves to catch blood flowing from the scaffold, or they would pay the executioner for a cup of fresh blood to drink. The belief persisted for centuries, drawing crowds of sick people to executions, hoping for a cure. The hand of glory, the severed hand of an executed criminal, dried and prepared according to specific rituals, was believed to have magical powers. Thieves supposedly used it to enter homes undetected. The executioner was the source, selling hands to those who believed in their power. Franz Schmidt engaged in medical practice alongside his execution work. He treated patients, dispensed remedies, earned money from healing as well as killing. The same hands that swung the sword also set broken bones, applied poultices, provided comfort. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble his contemporaries, or perhaps the contradiction was the point. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment about what dark historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we need to discuss the macabre economy that surrounded the executioner's work. The bodies of the executed were valuable commodities. Far from being simply disposed of, they were harvested, processed, and sold. The executioner was at the center of this trade, profiting from death in ways beyond his official salary. Rope used for hanging was particularly prized. A piece of the hangman's rope was believed to bring good luck, to protect against illness, to ward off evil. People paid for fragments, small pieces they could carry as talismans. The executioner saved his used ropes and sold them piece by piece, a steady income from otherwise disposable equipment. Skin was tanned into leather, used for various purposes, both practical and magical. The skin of executed criminals was believed to have special properties, and objects made from human leather book covers, purses, even clothing commanded premium prices. The executioner provided the raw material. Bones, teeth, fingers all had their buyers. Apothecaries purchased body parts for medicines. Practitioners of folk magic wanted materials for their rituals. Collectors sought curiosities. The executioner was the supplier, processing bodies with an eye toward maximizing their commercial value. The skull was especially valuable. Skull cups were made for drinking, particularly alcohol. The practice was believed to cure various ailments. Powdered skull, mixed into drinks or food, was a remedy for epilepsy and other conditions. Intact skulls sold to medical schools, to natural philosophers, to anyone with money and interest. This trade was open and legal, though sometimes regulated. The executioner's right to profit from bodies was recognized as part of his compensation. Cities that wanted to attract skilled executioners had to offer good terms, including access to bodies for the medical and magical trade. The economy of death was comprehensive. Nothing was wasted. The condemned provided not just spectacle and justice, but also commercial products that flowed into the broader economy. The executioner was entrepreneur as well as killer, maximizing the value of the human material that passed through his hands. Executions were public spectacles, attended by crowds that could number in the thousands. The scaffold was a stage, and the executioner was the lead performer in a drama of crime, punishment, and death. The crowd came for many reasons. Entertainment, certainly in an era before mass media, public executions were one of the few spectacles available. A beheading or hanging broke the monotony of daily life, provided something to talk about, created shared experience. People marked their calendars for execution days. The crowd also came for justice. They wanted to see criminals punished, wanted to know that the murderer who had terrorized the neighborhood or the thief who had robbed their homes was getting what they deserved. The public nature of execution satisfied this desire for visible retribution. Some came for religious reasons. The execution was a moral drama, a demonstration of sin and its consequences, a reminder of the fate awaiting the wicked. Preachers delivered sermons. The condemned was given opportunity for repentance. The soul's fate hung in the balance alongside the body's. The atmosphere was festive. Vendors sold food and drink, sausages, bread, beer. It was a social occasion, a chance to see neighbors, to gossip, to be part of something larger than ordinary life. Children attended with parents, absorbing lessons about law, order, and the price of transgression. The crowd was also a jury. They judged the executioner's performance, reacting to clean kills with approval, to botched executions with anger. A skilled executioner earned respect. An incompetent one faced jeers, thrown objects, sometimes violence. The executioner performed for this audience, knowing his reputation depended on their verdict. The scaffold was raised so everyone could see. The better the view, the better the deterrent effect at least. That was the theory. Wealthy spectators might rent windows overlooking the square, getting the best vantage points. The poor crowded at street level, craning for glimpses. Everyone wanted to witness the moment of death. The executioner's nightmare was the botched execution, the beheading that required multiple strokes, the hanging where the rope broke, the burning where the fire wouldn't catch. These failures were professional disasters that could have fatal consequences. Beheadings were most prone to failure. The sword stroke had to be precise, powerful, perfectly placed. If the condemned moved at the last moment, if the executioner's concentration wavered, if the blade was slightly off angle, the head might not come clean. Then came the horror, the condemned still alive, screaming, blood pouring from a half-severed neck. The executioner hacking desperately to finish the job. Franz Schmidt recorded his failures alongside his successes. Most of his beheadings with one stroke, clean death. But some required 2 strokes, occasionally 3. Each failure was noted, a mark against his professional record. More than 2 strokes was considered incompetent. 3 was scandalous. Hangings could fail when ropes broke. The condemned would fall to the ground, injured but alive, and have to be hanged again with a new rope. Sometimes the knot slipped, leaving the condemned strangling slowly instead of dying quickly. Sometimes the condemned was too heavy or too light for the rope's length, resulting in slow suffocation or rarely decapitation. The wheel could fail if the executioner misjudged his blows, striking too hard and killing quickly, or not hard enough and failing to break bones properly. Fire could fail if the wood was wet, if the wind shifted, if the condemned somehow freed themselves from the stake. Failed executions endangered the executioner. Crowds expected professional competence, and when they didn't get it, they might turn violent. There are records of executioners being attacked by mobs, outraged by botched executions. Some were beaten, some were killed. Mob justice administered to the administrator of official justice. The fear of failure haunted executioners. They developed rituals, superstitions, careful preparations, anything, to ensure that when the moment came, everything would work as intended. A lifetime of skill could be undone by a single bad day. When the executioner failed badly enough, a crowd might take matters into their own hands. The same mob that came to watch death might deal death themselves, turning on the executioner who had failed them. The logic was brutal but consistent. The crowd expected a performance, a clean death, justice properly administered. When the executioner delivered suffering instead of spectacle, when his incompetence prolonged the condemned's agony, the crowd felt cheated, outraged, offended. Their anger needed an outlet. Records document executioners beaten by crowds. After particularly botched executions, the mob might surge onto the scaffold, fists and clubs finding the man who had failed. Guards tried to protect him, but guards were few, and the crowd was many. Sometimes the executioner escaped with bruises, sometimes with broken bones. Sometimes he didn't escape at all. In extreme cases, crowds killed executioners. Having witnessed an execution gone horribly wrong, the mob executed their own justice, beating the executioner to death or hanging him from his own scaffold. The authorities might investigate, might arrest ringleaders, but the executioner was still dead. The threat of mob violence shaped executioner behavior. It incentivized competence. The cost of failure was potentially mortal. It encouraged preparations, practice, maintenance of equipment. An executioner who wanted to live did his job well done. It also created perverse incentives. Some executioners killed the condemned quickly, regardless of the sentence, preferring to face official displeasure over mob violence. If the sentence was breaking on the wheel, supposed to last hours, but the crowd was restless and angry, an executioner might deliver a quick death and claim it was accidental. Better a reprimand from the magistrates than a beating from the crowd. The mob's presence was a constant in the executioner's calculations. He performed for them, feared them, managed them. They were his audience and his potential executioners. The scaffold was a stage where a bad performance could be fatal. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment. Because now we're going to explore how executioners built families in a society that shunned them. Marriage for an executioner was constrained by his infamy. No family with any claim to honor would allow their daughter to marry him. No guild master would give his daughter to someone whose children would be born into dishonor. The executioner's marriage pool was limited to those who were already outside respectable society. Executioners typically married the daughters of other executioners. These marriages created networks, webs of connection spanning regions, providing professional contacts and family ties. An executioner in Nuremberg might marry a woman from an executioner family in Munich. Their children might marry executioners' children from Frankfurt. The caste maintained itself through strategic marriage. Other dishonorable professions provided potential spouses. Gravediggers, who handled dead bodies and shared the executioner's pollution. Skinners and tanners, who dealt with animal carcasses and the stench of rotting flesh. Shepherds, whose isolation from the community marked them as marginal. These families might intermarry with executioners. Their dishonor, finding dishonor dot, the children of such marriages were born into limitation. They inherited their parents' infamy, regardless of their own conduct. A boy born to an executioner had essentially one career path, following his father. A girl born to an executioner could marry only within the dishonorable trades. The system reproduced itself across generations. Love presumably existed within these constraints. Franz Schmidt married Anna, daughter of an executioner from another city. Their marriage lasted decades. They raised children together. Whatever they felt for each other existed within a framework that had chosen them before they could choose themselves. The executioner's house sheltered these families. Isolated, marked, avoided, but also a home with the ordinary domestic routines that any home contained. Children growing, meals cooking, fires burning, life continuing even under the burden of infamy. The executioner was a monster to the outside world. Inside his house, he was a husband and father. Growing up as an executioner's child meant growing up isolated, marked, different. From earliest awareness, these children knew they were not like other children, that they carried a taint they had not earned that other children shunned them. Parents pulled their sons and daughters away from the executioner's children, warning them against contamination. Games that included all the neighborhood children excluded the hangman's kids. Friendships that might have formed were prevented by parental vigilance. The executioner's children played alone or with each other. School, where it existed, brought its own humiliations. Other students knew who they were. Teachers might treat them differently, some with contempt, others with awkward sympathy. The executioner's children learned early that they were outsiders, that their presence made others uncomfortable, that they would never fully belong. As they grew older, career limitations became clear. A craftsman's son could apprentice to his father's guild, secure in his future. The executioner's son could apprentice nowhere except with his father or another executioner. The daughter could marry no one respectable. The path forward was narrow and fixed. Some rebelled. Records exist of executioner sons who ran away, who tried to escape their destiny by fleeing to distant cities. Most were eventually discovered, their origins revealed, their brief freedom ended. The system was designed to be inescapable. It mostly succeeded. Others accepted their fate. They watched their fathers work, learned the trade, took pride in mastering skills that others couldn't imagine. They found identity within the constraints imposed on them, becoming expert practitioners of a profession no one else wanted. Franz Schmidt's sons followed him into the trade. His daughters married within the dishonorable networks. His efforts to escape infamy were partly for them. He wanted his children to have opportunities he had never had. His eventual rehabilitation was a family achievement, lifting not just himself, but his descendants from the taint that had burdened them. Escape from the executioner's profession seemed impossible, but some tried. They ran away. They petitioned authorities. They sought new lives in places where no one knew their origins. Mostly they failed, but the attempts illuminate how desperately people wanted to escape. The simplest method was geographic flight. An executioner's son might travel to a distant city, claim a false background, try to apprentice himself to a respectable trade. If no one recognized him, if he could sustain the deception, he might escape. But executioner families were networked. Information traveled, and sooner or later, recognition usually came. When discovered, the consequences were severe. Guilds that had unknowingly admitted executioners' children expelled them immediately. Marriages based on false pretenses could be annulled. The fugitive was returned to his origins, perhaps worse off than before, marked now as a liar as well as infamous. Some sought legal remedy. Petitions to territorial lords or emperors asked for rehabilitation, a formal declaration that removed the taint of infamy, restored legal honor, opened doors that had been closed. These petitions were rarely granted. The legal system that created infamy was reluctant to undo it. Military service offered one possible path. Soldiers were not quite respectable, but they were not infamous either. An executioner's son who joined the army escaped his father's profession and entered a world where his origins mattered less. If he survived and distinguished himself, he might build a new identity. Becoming an executioner in a distant territory was another option. Not escape from the profession, but escape from its local constraints. A man might start over, build a reputation on his own merits, free from his father's shadow. The infamy remained, but at least it was his own. Most who tried to escape eventually failed. The system was remarkably effective at keeping people in their place, at passing dishonor from generation to generation, at ensuring that someone's great-great-grandchildren would still be paying for an ancestor's misfortune. Franz Schmidt achieved what almost no executioner ever achieved: legal rehabilitation, the removal of infamy, the restoration of honor. After 45 years of service, he was granted restitution of honor by the emperor, becoming a respectable citizen for the first time in his life. The effort took decades. France lived impeccably, avoided scandal, maintained his reputation. He cultivated connections with the magistrates who employed him, built goodwill through competent service, demonstrated that an executioner could be a man of virtue. He was positioning himself, year after year, for the petition that might change everything. He kept his diary partly as evidence. The meticulous records showed his professionalism, his reliability, his dedication to duty. When he finally petitioned for rehabilitation, he could point to decades of documented service, proof that he had earned the honor he sought. The petition went to the emperor in 1593, seeking removal of the infamy that had attached to his family. The imperial court considered it, delayed, considered again. Years passed. France continued working, continued hoping, continued waiting for an answer. In 1617, finally, the answer came. Emperor Ferdinand II granted Franz Schmidt rehabilitation, declaring him and his descendants free from infamy, restoring them to full legal honor. France was in his early 60s. He had spent his entire adult life as an executioner, and now, at the end, he was no longer infamous. The rehabilitation was remarkable, almost miraculous. Very few executioners ever achieved it. France's combination of exceptional service, careful positioning, and good fortune had made the impossible possible. His children and grandchildren would be free in ways he had never been. France retired shortly after his rehabilitation, living out his remaining years as a respectable citizen. He died in 1634, honored at last, his life's work vindicated. His diary survived, preserving his story for future generations who would wonder what it meant to be the most necessary and most despised man in town. The world that created the executioner eventually changed enough to eliminate him. Public executions, once central to the administration of justice, gradually disappeared, replaced by private deaths behind prison walls. The executioner's role diminished, transformed, eventually vanished in its traditional form. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about punishment. Philosophers argued that torture was unreliable, that public execution was barbaric, that punishment should reform rather than merely destroy. Cesare Beccarius, on Crimes and Punishments 1764, attacked the entire system of spectacular violence. Gradually, governing elites began to listen. Torture was abolished in most European jurisdictions during the 18th century. Prussia banned it in 1754, Bavaria in 1806. Without torture, the executioner lost half his role. He became purely a killer, not also an interrogator, and his expertise diminished accordingly. Public executions declined more slowly. France abolished them only in 1939, Britain in 1868. But the trend was clear. Death was moving behind closed doors, away from the crowds, into the privacy of prison yards. The spectacle that had defined the executioner's work was ending. The executioner profession adapted and declined. Some became prison officials, still performing executions, but without the public performance. Some found that their services were no longer needed as execution methods changed. The guillotine, the electric chair, lethal injection required less skill, less craft, less of the executioner's traditional expertise. The social position of executioners changed as well. The hereditary system broke down. New executioners were simply employees, hired for a job rather than born into a caste. The infamy faded, not because society suddenly respected executioners, but because the category lost its meaning. When anyone could become an executioner, being an executioner's child meant nothing special. Today, executions continue in many countries, but the executioner as a social type infamous. Hereditary, skilled, isolated has disappeared. Franz Schmidt's world is gone, replaced by bureaucratic death administered by anonymous functionaries. Whether this represents progress is a question that different people answer differently. And so our time with the executioner comes to an end. The scaffold is empty now. The gallows have been torn down, the wheels broken, the fires extinguished. The executioner's house outside the city walls is just another building, if it survives at all. The taint of infamy has lifted, dissolved by centuries of social change, leaving no trace in the descendants of those marked families. But the executioner's world was real, and for 300 years it shaped the lives of thousands of people who lived in it. They woke each morning in houses marked by death. They practiced crafts of killing that required real skill, real knowledge, real expertise. They raised families in isolation, knowing their children would inherit their burden. They endured hatred from a society that needed them and despised them for being needed. But the hypocrisy is the core of the story. Society required executioners. Without them, the law couldn't function. Order couldn't be maintained. Criminals couldn't be punished. Everyone understood this. And yet society treated executioners as polluted, contaminated, untouchable. The very people who demanded justice recoiled from those who provided it. They wanted clean hands even while requiring dirty work. The executioners knew this. They felt it every day: the averted eyes, the empty taverns, the children forbidden to play with their children. They served the state faithfully and were rewarded with contempt. They did what no one else would do and were punished for doing it. The contradiction defined their lives. Franz Schmidt's diary is a monument to this contradiction. Entry after entry, execution after execution, he recorded his professional service while living his professional exclusion. He killed for the state for 45 years and then had to beg the emperor to declare him honorable. His rehabilitation was the exception that proved the rule. Almost no one escaped the infamy. Almost no one was ever forgiven for doing the necessary work. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider the executioners. Not as monsters, they were people born into circumstances they didn't choose, doing work that had to be done. Consider the weight they carried, the isolation they endured, the strange pride they took in being good at something terrible. Consider what it meant to live your entire life as the most hated man in town. We like to think we're beyond such hypocrisy now. We like to think we wouldn't create such outcasts, such scapegoats, such categories of the permanently tainted. But someone still does the work we prefer not to think about. Someone still slaughters the animals, guards the prisoners, administers the lethal injections. We've changed the methods, but we haven't eliminated the need or the instinct to look away. From those who meet at dot, the executioner's house stands empty. The executioner's trade is extinct, but the question he embodied remains. How do we treat those who do the necessary work that respectable people won't do? The answer, throughout most of human history, has not reflected well on us. Rest well. The executioner is gone, but his ghost asks questions we still haven't answered.